In 1878, a crimson sandstorm rolled out of the high desert and swallowed Dust Valley whole. Daylight vanished under a red gauze, turning the sun into a bleeding coin. The storm moaned through the alleys, and under doors poured grit into coffee cups, and hymnals erased boot prints as fast as men could make them. Shutters rattled like dice in a gambler's palm. Horses screamed. Somewhere a church bell stuttered, then fell silent under the weight of dust. And in the middle of that moving wall, a young woman stepped through as if born from it, hat brim pulled low, jaw set, eyes fierce with pride, and yet trembling from the knowledge that fate like weather can turn without warning. She braced herself against the gusts, pressed forward, and vanished again into the rushing red. A year later, Dust Valley still remembered that storm the way old men remember a gunshot by the echo. The sand had settled, but its taste lingered in the boards of the saloon, in the seams of coats, in the breath of the town. The sun here wasn't golden. It was merciless, beating the ground, until every stone seemed to sizzle. Saloons bleached pale as bones. Heat shimmered above the single strip of road that stitched the buildings together, and wind carried the hiss of dry grass along the fence lines like a warning too tired to raise its voice. Every morning, Isabel Vega walked that road with a leather satchel against her hip and a wool shawl pulled against the sun. Behind her came the small percussion of children, bare feet, nervous laughter, slates clacking. She was Dust Valley's new schoolteacher by necessity, and its healer by stubbornness, brewing willow bark for fevers, stitching gashes, setting broken fingers with hands that did not shake. She spoke softly in English, more softly still in Spanish, and people who had decided years ago not to trust anyone found themselves trusting her a little anyway, because she told them the truth straight and charged almost nothing, when nothing was all they had. Dust Valley's order, such as it was, belonged to Jebediah Kane. They called him Ironhand because his right hand, shattered in a fight years before, had been swaddled long ago in a black iron brace that never left his fist. Kane owned the livery, the stage route, the deputies, and whatever parts of men fear will sell. He leaned that iron fist on counters, on doors, on backs. When folks said the law, they meant the thing Kane tolerated until it bothered him. On a morning like any other, Isabel crossed the street nodding to Mrs. Finch, who ran the mercantile, and to Mr. Doolin, who still wore his Civil War coat because it had outlived his courage. From the saloon porch, Kane watched his dark eyes following her, the way a shadow does at noon, flat and absolute. Sunlight flared on his iron brace. His mouth made the suggestion of a smile, a promise of trouble dressed up like a greeting. "That little healer thinks she can change Dust Valley," he said to the man polishing glasses that would be dusty again by noon. "This town bends to me. And so will she." By afternoon, the schoolhouse smelled of chalk and sun-warmed wood. Isabel traced letters on the board. The children repeated them, not shy, just careful, as if every letter were a step out of something. A breeze pushed at the door. Then it slammed open so hard, a long crack ran through the plaster like lightning. Two of Kane's men stepped inside, spurs dragging. The taller of the two grinned in a way that never reached his eyes. He thumbed toward the street as if the street were a command. "Books down," he said. "Mr. Kane needs help at the stables. These brats'll be shoveling by sundown." Chalk clicked against the floor. Isabel turned. She was not tall for a man, but tall for most men here, and that made some of them mean. She set her shoulders. "They stay," she said. "They're learning. If your boss wants to argue it, he can come argue it with me." The grin sharpened. "Lady, you don't tell Ironhand no." Something scraped at the doorway. a slow, metallic breath steel on steel. The men turned. Caleb Morgan stood there, framed by light, his shirt dark, with soot a hammer loose in his hand. His eyes were gray and steady, the kind of steady that made other men reevaluate their decisions. "You heard her," he said. "Get out." They laughed, and then the laughter broke. Caleb took one step and a second, and it was like a wall had decided to walk. The men spat to save face and backed away. "We'll tell him," one muttered. When the last child had run home and the light had grown thin, Isabel sat with her palms flat on the desk to quiet the tremor that always arrived after courage. A knock at the frame made her jolt. Caleb didn't step in. He leaned against the wood, as if a man as large as him could hesitate to enter a room. "You shouldn't have to stand against men like Cain alone," he said. The forge smell still clung to him, iron heat, something like rain that never fell. "I don't want trouble," she said, hating the smallness of her voice. He met her eyes. "You already have it. And trouble has a name." He came by the schoolhouse in the evenings after that, never long enough to be a bother, always long enough to be useful. Hinges stopped complaining. Benches learned to be steady. He split wood not because anyone asked him to, but because winter always comes when men are looking elsewhere. Isabel brought him coffee that wasn't good, and he drank it as if excellence were overrated. In return, he kept his words to the necessary ones, and his watch to the shadows that moved wrong. Little by little, she told him things that she'd left New Mexico, not because she wanted to forget, but because staying was a more intolerable way of remembering. That her mother had taught her to read bones and stars and the color of a fever. That the last town had not liked a woman who told the truth to men with money, and she had not liked being told to stop. He told her less. He spoke of a trail that had given him a different name, the Quick, and of a life where his hands had been famous for how fast they could take something away from another man. He had stopped. He intended to keep stopping. You can decide a thing and still have to decide it again every day. Cain didn't like being told no, because no was contagious in a town if you let it spread. He sent men to the school twice more. The third time they came at night to the clinic room at the back, where Isabel had been cutting a splinter out of a ranch hand's palm by lamplight. They kicked the door open and swept jars off shelves with their forearms, and told her Cain didn't like charity because it made people forget what they owed. "Mr. Cain offers you something better than charity, one," said his mouth smiling while his eyes stayed flat. "He offers respectable company. You say yes, and you won't need to patch up cowboys for pennies." Isabel dabbed alcohol on a cloth and wrapped the ranch hand's palm, and didn't look at the men while she did it. "Tell Mr. Cain I already gave the only answer he'll get." The one in front turned a bottle over and watched it break on the floor. "You should be more careful with your supplies." Caleb arrived not long after on some errand that had become habit. The men did not enjoy the way the room felt with him in it. They left with the dry laughter of men building a story they'd prefer to tell over drinks than test in the dark. "Thank you," Isabel said when the door shut. Caleb shook his head. "Don't thank me for standing where any man ought to stand." He hesitated. "I'll fix your shelf." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight you'll let me clean your knuckles." In lamplight, his hands looked more scar than skin. "You're a healer," he said. "You should save your skill for someone who deserves it." "Everyone bleeds the same," she said, and dabbed alcohol. He didn't flinch, which told her how much he'd learned not to. Over the next weeks, the town bent itself around their routine, as towns do, pretending not to notice the way the blacksmith spent evenings at the schoolhouse, pretending not to notice that the doorway looked too narrow with him in it, pretending not to notice that Cain watched all of it from the saloon balcony with an expression so still It wasn't an expression at all. Isabel taught children the map of letters. She set bones and poulticed burns. The folk who had learned to survive by keeping their heads down kept them down a little less. One night, rain came in hard from the west, slashing the windows, making the roof tick and click, as if it were trying to remember a song. Isabel lit a lantern. Caleb sat at the table across from her, big hands restless on the wood jaw, clenched like a man bracing to deliver bad news to himself. "You don't know me," he said finally. "Not the part that keeps me up. I was that man they told stories about in other valleys. I've got graves behind me the wind hasn't covered. I swore off the gun when I came here. Some days the swearing is easy. Some days it's like holding a door shut with ghosts pushing on the other side. If Cain keeps pushing, I'll have to become him again." The lantern hissed. She traced the scar at his temple with her eyes, but not her hand. "You fix hinges, you split wood, you drink terrible coffee politely. You stand in doorways so children can finish their lessons. If you have to become anyone again, become that." His breath left him in a sound that might have been a laugh, if it had known how. He reached for her hand, a slow, deliberate movement, as if the air had weight, and she gave it to him. Outside, lightning pulled the sky apart. Inside, something was tied instead of cut. Cain watched. He had deputies with stars and men with no stars who did the real work. He had a way of leaning his iron fist on any surface until it remembered who it owed loyalty to. He sent word to Isabel in a way that would let him pretend it was a gentleman's offer. "Marry me, and let me make you safe." When she sent word back that safety delivered at gunpoint wasn't safety at all, he changed the word marry to own and stop pretending. Dust Valley braced the way a dog does when it hears a sound no one else hears yet. They took Isabel at dusk 2 days later when the clinic door was closing and the street was empty except for men who had decided being elsewhere was the best job they had. A hand over her mouth, a forearm across her ribs, the quick, efficient work of rope. She fought, and one of them hissed in surprise when her heel found his shin. But they had numbers and practice. They threw her into a wagon and drove for the canyon while the last light slipped down the walls of buildings and left them colorless. James No Caleb found the clinic's back door open and a jar rolling in a slow circle on the floor, as if it had nowhere important to be. He said her name and the room gave it back with pity. A boy came running, breath whistling. "The canyon," he said. "Mister." Cain says he didn't finish the sentence because sometimes children learn how to use silence faster than adults do. Caleb went home by the back trail and knelt where the floor plank had been cut to come up easier. The iron of the revolver was cold as a river at night. The belt was stiff with history. He wrapped it around his hips and fastened it slow. Once more he said not to the room, or to God who prefers other prayers, but to the man he had invited back inside his own chest. Cain liked ceremony. Torches stabbed the canyon walls. Men laughed too loud because fear prefers that. Isabel stood tied to a post, the rope abrasive enough to demand attention. She stood straight anyway. Cain's boots crunched in the gravel as he circled her, his iron brace, gleaming whenever the fire found it. "Tomorrow the preacher will be right here," he said. "We'll do it proper. Your blacksmith friend, he'll be something the coyotes argue over. I'm a merciful man. I'm letting him live to watch." She stared at him, which some men mistake for fear, and some men recognize as contempt, and all men feel. The hoofbeats came like thunder stitched into the ground. Caleb didn't ride in showy. He rode in like a man who had something to do and wanted to do it well. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped and walked forward as if the canyon were a church. and he intended to tell the truth in it. "Let her go," he said. Kane smiled. Or what he asked, the kind of question a man asks when he thinks he already knows the ending and just wants to admire the stitching. Gunfire is a kind of weather. It arrives fast, rearranges things without asking permission, and leaves men describing the taste of air afterward. The first shot split the torch smoke and made everyone else shoot on account of nerves. Caleb moved with the economy of a man who had wasted motion before and had learned better. His body remembered angles the mind had forgotten. He pulled men into the dark places where torches didn't reach and led them out again in pieces. A bullet burned a line along his arm, easy as a match does paper. He ignored it. The rope at Isabel's shoulder jerked and frayed under a shot, meant for him and missed. She went very still because stillness in some moments is how you help. The canyon learned to be quiet again. Kane stood alone, the iron on his hand catching firelight, the man attached to it breathing harder than he liked to be seen breathing. He lifted his pistol and his chin together. "You should have stayed dead, Morgan," he said. It was quieter. Caleb's voice didn't have room in it for anything but fact. "I was dead," he said, "until her. No one can say how long a duel lasts except the two men in it. For everyone else, it's the length of a blink they wish they had held longer." Two shots rode the same air. One man fell. The other stood and did not smile, because smiling is for when the bill is already paid. Caleb let the gun fall. He went to Isabel and cut her free, with hands that shook only after the rope was gone. She fell into him, and her breath came out in a shudder, and the part of his chest that he had kept locked for years gave way like a door that had been waiting for a kinder knock. "You came," she said. "I'll always come," he answered, which was the hardest and easiest truth he had. They rode back slow at dawn. The town assembled in doorways like theater seats. Nobody clapped. Dust Valley had learned that victory attracts trouble if you boast out loud. Mrs. Finch brought a bucket and a rag and cleaned Caleb's arm without speech. Mr. Doolan tipped his hat not to Caleb but to the fact of mourning. The preacher stood with his Bible closed because sometimes the book has already been read. Isabel found the clinic as she had left it, except that flowers now sat in an old tin cup on the step that no one admitted putting there. She swept glass into the dustpan and coiled the rope pieces for the sheriff like a lesson carefully prepared. Children started taking shy steps toward the schoolhouse again by afternoon because their mothers knew that routine is a kind of medicine. Busy is how towns heal when they can't. Men hammered at boards that weren't loose. Women scrubbed floors that were clean. Kane's chair in the saloon stayed empty, and men walked around it the way you do a grave. That night, the telegraph clicked east, then south, then farther. The operator didn't read the words because he liked his sleep. Caleb walked the perimeter of his place and checked what could be checked, latch-hinged the nail on the step he'd been meaning to set deeper. He set a chair near the front window where a man could look onto the road without being obvious about it. He put the revolver on the table and looked at it the way a sober man looks at a bottle, without nostalgia, without contempt, with the weary respect an enemy can deserve. Isabel braided her hair and unbraided it, because some nights the hands need a task. She touched the bell rope at the schoolhouse, the smooth, worn spot on the handle of the kettle, the little clay cup a child had pressed into her palm last week, saying for tea in a whisper as if generosity might be revoked if spoken at full volume. She stood by the window. In the cottonwoods, the wind spoke in small syllables like prayer beads slipping through a hand. Night rose like a man stands from a chair, slow first, then all at once. The moon lit a pale road. For a while, a shape sat up on the ridge where shrubs grow stubborn. It did not move. Then it wasn't there at all, or never had been. Isabel came to the doorway and found Caleb with his hand on the revolver, not holding, just touching the way you press two fingers to a pulse. "Will they come?" she asked. "Someone will," he said, "the kind of honesty that doesn't waste anyone's time. Then we'll meet them." He took her hand. Houses can grow deeper foundations in a single second. By morning, two riders came down Main Street, slow, not looking anywhere in particular, in the way that lets you see everything. One had a coat too fine for this zip code. The other had a saddle whose creak suggested he did not intend mere passing. They didn't stop. They rode on and spooked no one badly enough to make sense of anything. Dust rose and settled behind them like a rumor changing its mind. Life, which is rude enough to continue, continued. Isabel rang the bell and the children came with the guilty delight that follows a day off. They took their little places and argued about where S belongs and whether Z is fun to write or just complicated. Caleb stood in the doorway and saw through her to the board where she wrote a sentence about rivers, and his breath caught because a sentence about rivers in a place that had forgotten them felt like a rebellion, smaller and braver than gunfire. You cannot hold a valley in a single story. Other stories run under it like creeks you can't see until they flood. South, a train carried a man with the same last name as Cain, and a mouth that didn't like smiling unless someone else was paying. East, a pair of men with city hats and big opinions folded a letter into a pocket where a badge might be someday if the right hand shook the right hand. North, a storm gathered on the mountain's spine and practiced the low song wind sings before it travels. Isabel and Caleb matched their days to the tasks that make people worth saving. She measured out powders by the tip of a knife. He measured boards by a length of twine. She told a mother that the fever would break if it was asked nicely and kept cool. He told a rancher that a nail-driven true doesn't creak under a load. They didn't put names on what they were because names are expensive out here and labels are hard to pry off later. They knew anyway. Cain's burial happened without music. Men who had never been brave enough to love him pretended to mourn him because pretending is cheap. His deputy, a man named Rook, who had never looked up long enough to learn the stars, took to wearing the iron brace like an heirloom. It didn't fit. He wore it anyway. Rook tried his hand at ruling and found it heavier than it looked. He sent two men to make an example in the mercantile and discovered Mrs. Finch had a shotgun that worked. He told the saloon keeper to raise prices and discovered the saloon keeper had debts to the same men Rook feared. He tried to collect from a widow and discovered that half the town would rather go hungry than let him count her coins. Power, it turns out, is a loan sharks don't like to extend to fools. He could have learned. He didn't. He went instead to the telegraph and paid for words to travel faster than horses. The words arrived in places with bigger rooms and worse air, and men whose hearts had never beat to the sound of their own boots. Those men read the words and smiled small. One afternoon, Isabel walked down to the riverbed that only remembered being a river when it rained. She knelt and pressed her palm to cool sand, where water hid below, not enough to drink enough to say, "Don't give up yet." Caleb came and crouched beside her without speaking. He took a small tin cup from his pocket, filled it from a seep, handed it to her. They sat until the sun fell and the cottonwoods gave back what little cool they'd borrowed from night. "What did you run from?" she asked, not unkindly. Everything he said then shook his head at his own answer. "Myself. That's the only one that keeps up." She smiled, then quick, and not for show. "Then you didn't run far enough." He wanted to answer and didn't need to. On market day, the town filled with the noise of men comparing bad prices to worse and calling it commerce. Children chased between carts. A woman from the river tribes traded baskets that could hold water and secrets both. Isabel bartered for needles and thread and rice. she could stretch into soup. Rook kept to the far side of the street and watched. Sometimes he smiled, and sometimes he wiped at the iron hand as if it would shine if he wished hard enough. Night dragged its velvet along the rooftops. A coyote talked to nobody who would admit listening. Caleb sat in his chair by the window and pretended to sleep. Isabel laid the bell rope across the table so she'd see it and feel the comfort of a task in the morning. She slept, woke, slept again, woke ready for nothing in particular, and everything at once. 2 weeks after the canyon, 3 men rode in together, the fine coat man from before a narrow fellow who moved like a snake muscling through grass, and a third with a face like a shovel blade. They didn't tip their hats to anyone. The fine coat man, Mr. Manton, he introduced himself, came to the blacksmiths first, and smiled like oil. Said he represented concerns from back east that liked towns to behave and money to flow, and he had heard there were disruptions here that might require a more organized approach. He sniffed at the forge smoke and made a note in his head about where to stand next time, so he wouldn't have to smell anything real. Caleb let him talk and then said nothing, as if he were ruminating. The snake-lean one watched Isabel cross the street and didn't blink. The shovel face waited like a door that would slam if you stood in the wrong place. They left without buying anything and went straight to the saloon, where men looked into their glasses and swore water had gotten into the whiskey again. Isabel found a note on the schoolhouse step at dusk, folded and tied with a red thread, meant to look like kindness. It said there were better ways to serve a town than by teaching its poorest to think they deserve more than they could pay for. It said even healers should know when their medicine does more harm than good. It said there would be a gathering at the church tomorrow to discuss new rules for a new era. It signed itself nothing at all, because a coward's hand writes fine. She handed it to Caleb. He read it twice. "They don't like you making people braver," he said. "They don't like anyone making people braver," she answered, and put the note in the stove, where it became what it was worth. The meeting at the church was loud without being loud enough. Manton spoke about stability and opportunity, the way a salesman speaks about a horse that bites. He suggested that a town like Dust Valley would be safer if all medicines and schooling passed through a more respectable office, one that could ensure standards. By standards, he meant his hands on everything. A handful of men nodded, because nodding is easier than standing. Mrs. Finch coughed loudly enough to be a vote. Caleb waited until Manton had finished winding the clockwork of his speech. Then he stood up and didn't say much at all. "We've got standards," he said. "We have ones that keep us alive. We don't need to buy new ones from a man who doesn't even sweat here." Nobody clapped. Dust Valley had learned applause attracts attention. The meeting ended with the kind of murmurs that mean nothing and everything. Manton smiled his small smile and left. That night, a window shattered in the clinic. Isabel walked through crunching glass and found the shelves undisturbed, the instruments where she'd set them. The broken pane said more than theft would have. She swept up and nailed a board and lay awake until the sky went gray, and then made coffee and went to work. Courage is mostly repetition. Rook came by mid-morning with a deputy and a piece of paper with words about licenses. Isabel read it and put it down. "Bring me a sick child and I'll show you my license," she said. The deputy looked at Rook, and Rook looked at the door, and the paper fluttered in a breeze that didn't know it was in a room. Trouble, when it decides to act, prefers dusk. They took a boy that time, Miguel, whose mother swept the saloon in the mornings and sang under her breath at night, so the child would not learn to be afraid of silence. They took him because he had run errands for Isabel and laughed at Rook's new iron glove, and because taking children teaches best. They tied him to a fence not far from the canyon and waited to see who would come. Isabel got the message because the kind of men who do a thing like that want their names in someone else's mouth. She told Caleb. His eyes went very flat. He went to the chest. He did not say once more, because once more had already become again. They moved together that time, the healer and the blacksmith who used to be something worse. Isabel rode with her knees tight and her shawl pinned down and a knife at her waist that she had used more often on splinters than men, but would not mind changing professions for. Caleb rode a line between hurry and plan. Night collected around them and carried the smell of sage. At the fence, two men waited, and Rook sat his horse like a man wearing a role that didn't fit. You do good work, he told Isabel. People like you, that's a problem. He grinned at Caleb. I want your reputation back in the ground. Town runs better when men like you are a rumor, not a fact. Let the boy go, Isabel said. They did not. They were counting on outrage to outrun intelligence. It did not tonight. Caleb stepped left and made a shadow look like two. Isabel stepped right and made a voice sound closer than she was. The first man fired at nothing. The second hesitated a second too long. That's all a second ever needs. Rook pulled the boy between him and the night and discovered the boy had elbows. The horse shied. The iron hand came up late. It met wood instead of bone. Caleb's shot broke the fence post and not the boy. Isabel was there with the knife. Quick and precise rope falling into the dust, like an argument that had lost its point. Rook rode because some men are braver at noon than midnight. The two hired men lay down unasked and stayed. Miguel sobbed in the small hiccuping way that means he will cry for real when he's safe. Isabel put her palm on his forehead, and her voice lowered into the register where it can do more than words. She said his name the way you say a spell. At home, the boy slept in the bed she gave him and dreamed about fences that became doors. The town woke to a story. Not everyone would tell the same, and that is how towns become something else. By collecting versions of courage, until one of them sticks. Manton did not like losing quietly. He tried a different angle ownership. He bought paper on the stage route and a deed to water rights. No one had had the gall to claim while the valley was thirsty. He sent a man with a hat full of paperwork to Mrs. Finch. She put it in a pie plate and told him to fetch it if he wanted it. He stayed on the porch. He was not hungry. Days stretched. The riverbed sulked, and then one afternoon remembered itself and ran in a thin sheet across sand. Children went barefoot into it and shrieked, and nobody said stop because that kind of water doesn't last. Caleb shot a horse in the street because the owner said he could hear God better in the open air. Isabel taught a child to shape the letter R and thought about the word redemption and how it uses the same letter and costs more. When the next telegram came, the operator's hands shook because he read the name at the bottom by accident, a brother. He folded the paper twice, and then again, and walked to the saloon. Because a man can do a careful thing and still need a drink. He handed the message to Manton. Company's coming, he said, because he liked to think he was the kind of person who made jokes. The riders arrived at twilight as if the light liked them best. They wore dust the way some men wear respect. They didn't go to the church. They didn't go to the sheriff. They didn't go to the saloon first either, which is how you know trouble has read the room. They went to the edge of town and looked at it from without. A hawk circled. Nobody pretended it was a good sign. Isabel set a pot of coffee on the stove. Caleb set the chair by the window where it belonged now. He put the revolver on the table again, and it didn't look more friendly for all its time indoors. She stood behind him and set her hand on his shoulder and desired a world where that would be enough. It wasn't. It was something. The sun went down. The cottonwoods took up their whisper. Coyotes made announcements about mice. Caleb said nothing and everything, with the way his jaw relaxed and tightened. Isabel thought about when she had arrived in the red wall a year ago, how she had walked until the dust thinned and the road began, and how a choice had felt like the only thing she could afford to carry. She thought about a boy reading his S slow and proud and how she had told him it was a good letter, because it knew how to bend and stand straight both. In the morning, the bell rang at the schoolhouse. Children ran because running is still the best way to be on time. The church door opened without announcing its reasons. The riders, these new ones with Cain's blood or Manton's money or something worse, sat their horses across from the blacksmith's and did not dismount. Men on the porch of the saloon sat smaller in their chairs. The air had that quality it sometimes gets before a storm, as if it were holding its breath for a long while to see if it might avoid some unpleasant work. Caleb stepped onto his porch. He didn't take the gun. He stood with his hands easy at his sides, and a man who didn't know better might have mistaken that for foolishness. Manton tipped the brim of his hat with 2 fingers and let the smile arrive late. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "we're not here for gunplay. We're here for terms." Caleb's eyes didn't move to the rifle in the shovel-faced man's hand or to the knife hidden poorly at the snake-lean one's boot. "Terms," he said. "Is that what you call what you do to towns?" "It's what we call peace," Manton said. "We can buy your forge. We can buy the school. We can buy the clinic. Or we can make it so no one can afford to use them. Men like Cain are messy, Mr. Morgan. We prefer clean solutions." Isabel stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, chalk still in her fingers. A smudge of white on the knuckle. She looked at the children, and back at the men, and found that the fear inside her had not fled, but had learned to sit a little farther back in the room. "This is a school day," she said to nobody who needed telling. Manton's eyes went to her and softened in the way a wolf's eyes do when it decides what kind of distance counts as leaping range. "Good morning, Miss Vega," he said. "We all admire your contributions." A strange quiet spread then, the kind that doesn't belong to fear or bravado, but to the space between them. The riders didn't move. The town didn't breathe. The cottonwoods didn't choose a side. "Tomorrow," Manton said at last, gathering his reins with fingers that didn't like to be seen with work on them, "we'll propose a plan everyone can live with. They usually mean some of us, Mrs. Finch announced to no one in particular. The riders turned their horses and went the dust behind them, making that soft apology dust makes for being what it is. Caleb exhaled. Isabel turned to the board and wrote the next letter. Children copied it, tongues poking serious at their lips. An army of small hands, arming themselves with pencil lead. It was not a happy ending. It wasn't an ending at all. It was a morning after a night when someone had come to your house and looked through the windows and left. It was a road that did not guarantee safety, but did guarantee itself stretching forward under a sky big enough to hold grief and hope at once. It was two people at a table, with a revolver between them and coffee cooling beside it, their hands finding each other. Not because that would fix anything, but because it had to start somewhere. It was a town learning again that the bravest things it does might look like ordinary work done in daylight. Beyond the last fence post in that strip of country where facts become stories and stories become law, something moved toward Dust Valley with the patience of weather. The Crimson Storm had not been the last. And if your heart beats for love and survival on the frontier, if you understand that some promises are kept in the quiet between storms, then stay close. The road ahead won't be kind, but they'll ride it together